Cory Van Zytveld, and I'm a historic site interpreter here at the Littleton Museum. Throughout history, humans have been taking long strands of fiber and made them into cloth. There are a multitude of ways that we have done this, but today I will be showing you and introducing you to the tools and techniques of 3 of these ways, and that will be weaving, knitting, and crochet. The first technique I'll use to show you how to take fiber, or in this case yarn, and turn it into fabric is through weaving. And to weave, you really don't need a lot of tools. In this instance, I have my loom, which is the frame that holds the yarn together while you're weaving it. And then we have a shuttle, and the shuttle moves back and forth across the loom, and that's what carries the yarn to do that. To begin my weaving, I've tied my yarn onto my loom, and then as you can see, there's these little teeth on the loom. These will actually hold the yarn in place while we're weaving. And so I will loop the yarn onto or through these teeth. And this type of yarn is called the warp. The warp is the yarn that holds onto the loom and keeps everything in place as you're weaving. There are lots of looms that come in all shapes and sizes. Some of them have a lot of working parts with like petals and things like that. But in order to learn how to weave and to do weaving, you really don't need a fancy loom. Something like this works just fine. My loom is all warped, so all my warp threads are on here. And now it is time to put some yarn on my shuttle. To begin weaving, I'll take my shuttle and I'll follow a very simple pattern, which is over, under, over, under. And this is the basic stitch, for lack of a better word, in weaving. And so I'll do over the first one, under the second one, over, under, over, under, over, under. And I'll keep doing that through the entire row. And then pull it through. This type of yarn, the yarn that goes crossways across the loom, is called the weft loom, or the weft yarn. So we have the warp yarn here, weft goes back and forth. I'm going to tighten this up a little bit. To go back the other direction, instead I want to do opposite of what I just did pattern-wise. So I went over, under that time. This time, because this thread right here, I went over it, I need to go under it this time. So I go under, over, over. And I keep doing that throughout the entire weaving. And the reason I do that is that it locks the yarn in place. If I were to follow the same pattern, the yarn would just pull through. It wouldn't keep that repeating pattern going. And so again, next row, just push these down. And again, next row, I will go over, under, and so on and so forth. And I'll keep doing this through the entire weaving until I'm done. There are some advanced weavers who start to do different patterns with this, so they might go over 2, under 1, and keep repeating that pattern. And this can make very elaborate patterns, but most basically what we're doing, we're just going to follow that over, under, and then under, over. I'm all done with my weaving, and to take it off I just simply pull up on the loops and then I'll do the same on the other side. And then I will snip off my knots. And then to finish this, if I wanted to, I could tie off these loops, cut them and tie them off, or I could slide my stitches to one side. Either way would work, but as you can see, my weaving is all done and I have a nice completed piece of fabric. The next form of fabric making I will show you is knitting, and knitting usually takes 2 needles. You need 2 needles to work together in order to create your fabric. I also have my yarn again here, and to begin you need to make loops, and knitting is a series of stitches, what we call stitches, but they happen to be loops that you knit on. And there's a multitude of ways to do this, but this is the way I learned how to do it. So I've created a knot which has a loop on the end there, and I've looped it onto my needle. Now as I'm knitting, these loops that I'm creating, they will live on my knitting needle. And I need to make sure that I keep all of my stitches on there, because if they fall off, they will create a hole in my fabric. I'll just keep creating the stitches that I need in order to make my fabric. Alright, so there's the stitches on my knitting needles, as you can see. And in order to make my fabric bigger, I will pass my knitting from one needle to the other by looping the yarn through them. So I will do this by inserting the needle through the loop, looping the yarn around, and pulling through. So I just created a new stitch, and I'm passing it on to my other needle. And if you'd like to find like tutorials and things like that, there are a ton of resources on the internet to show you how to do this. This is just to show you the different tools and techniques used in making fabric. So I will continue on to do this until I have my completed knitting. So I'm done with my second row. You can see it's a little bit bigger than it was before. I've knitted a good amount of the fabric here, and I'm now going to finish it off, which is basically just looping it through the previous stitch. And the thing about knitting is you can make it as big or as small as you want. You can vary the different patterns to create different textures. There's ways that you can make it bigger or smaller. So for example, if you're knitting a sweater, you can do like an armhole on it, or maybe the neck hole. There's lots of different things that you can do with knitting, but this is just the most basic form of knitting: 2 knitting needles and the yarn. And I'm knitting a stitch and then looping the previous stitch over it. And this just finishes off my fabric. Do the last one, pull, cut off the end and then pull it through, and as you can see, there is my nice little knitted swatch of fabric. The third and final technique I will show you is how to crochet. And crochet is the tool that you need is just a crochet hook. So you can see it's just a long straight line and it has a hook at the end. And to start my stitch or to start my crochet, I will make a slip knot and pull that onto my crochet hook. Now the thing about crochet is that at any point in time you're only worrying about one stitch. If you remember in knitting, I had several stitches on my knitting needle. Crochet isn't like that, so when I'm doing this, I will just create a chain of stitches by looping the yarn over and then pulling through. And I'll keep doing that for as long as I want it to go on my piece. So however wide I want it to be, that's how many stitches I will make it. And so as you can see, here are all of my stitches. So each one is like a V. Those are the stitches that I will be working off of. So again, different than knitting, because knitting all of the stitches, all of those were still on my knitting needle. There's a lot of different types of stitches that you can do in crochet to make different patterns, and you can get very ornate with it. For today, I'm just going to do a single stitch, which I will go through my second V, pull through, and then loop again, and pull through. And then I'll continue to do that through the entire thing. So I've reached the end of my second row, and then to make my fabric bigger, I'll just continue to do that until I get to the end of where I need to go. I finished the end of my row, and so I will finish it off pretty easily. Just cut off the end and then pull it through. And so that's what my crocheted fabric looks like. So here are my final pieces next to the tools that we used. So you can see I have my knitting here, my weaving here, and along with the loom and the shuttle. I have my knitting here with my 2 knitting needles, and then I have my crochet here with my crochet hook. And if you look closely, you can see very distinct pattern differences on these. So on the weaving, you can of course see the over-under that we did to get to this. And for the knitting, the type of pattern that I did gives you these V shapes that you can see here. On the back, it'll give you a U shape. And so this is always well, it isn't always, but this can be considered the right side of the fabric, and this is the wrong side of the fabric, although sometimes you will see this opposite. And then you can see with crocheting, it has a much almost chunkier pattern to it. This is the single stitch that I did, but it gives you a much thicker piece of fabric at the end than maybe these other 2 techniques do. So there you see, they're all All slightly different, but all good ways to make fabric. Thank you for joining me today as I introduced you to the 3 different techniques of weaving, knitting, and crochet. To test your knowledge on these different techniques and their differences, please visit the City of Littleton website under the Littleton Museum page. And then also, please stay tuned for future videos. Thank you.